everyone, coming to you again with my last Disney vs. original work. Yay! I am so excited to review this one, even though this particular film that I will be leaving off with until December is one of the Disney films that often gets fairly overlooked and is not really considered one of Disney's finest works. But nonetheless, it is a Disney work, and it is based on a original source material, but again, fairly loosely. There's going to be tons of stuff and tons of information that I'm going to give you in this video that does not coincide a lot with what the Disney version takes, but from what I could gather, there is still some ideas and still some elements that are fairly similar in nature as far as plot and characters are concerned. And this particular Disney work original source material we're going to talk about is, yes, The Black Cauldron. And I think this really was kind of the start. I think, like, literally, this is one after Winnie the Pooh. I'm not skipping over anything. Where Disney kind of entered into this really dark-esque era, meaning that the stuff that they started to produce didn't just get really popular, it didn't really get recognized, it was fairly overlooked until we get to the 90s, which hopefully I can get to by December. And the thing being is that a lot of what Disney has done, for the most part, is it seems like that they just didn't really know what to do with these ideas. And from what I've looked through this original source material, they really did have a lot to work with. It's just I don't think they used a lot of it to their full potential. And I think that's probably what's a huge problem for this particular Disney film, The Black Cauldron, and why it got less money than a Care Bears movie. If you watch the Nostalgica's review on The Black Cauldron, you'll realize that, yes, the Care Bears movie made more money than a Disney film. So that's fairly sad, but we are still going to look at this nonetheless, and I'm going to kind of start off with what basically The Black Cauldron is based on. Now, I'm going to look at 2 of the 5 of the Chronicles of Prydian, which is basically what the Black Cauldron is trying to use as source material, and basically it is by Lloyd Alexander, and there are a total of 5 books within this children's fantasy series. Again, The Black Cauldron is sort of a fantasy, but it only uses elements from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th book, but not necessarily significant chunks of it compared to the 1st and the 2nd book. So I'm only going to look at the 1st and 2nd book, and I'm not going to look at the 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th, because I figured that it's more important for you to get, I think, a sense of these different kinds of plots, and maybe a sense of how the characters may resemble differently compared to the Disney work as I go through this. So basically, the first book is the Book of 3, and it sort of starts off in the same. You have Turin, who's living on a farm, and he has this enchanter who is sort of like a mentor slash guardian, and his name is Ser Dalben. And the other interesting thing, though, is they have another character in the original work who kind of looks after Turin, and this person is a farmer and a retired soldier named Cole. C-O-L-L. And for the most part, it starts off fairly the same in the fact that Taran has this like big goal. He wants to be like a great warrior, and he doesn't really like the farming lifestyle, obviously, and basically, what ends up happening sort of right away as far as plot-wise is concerned is that we see how Disney completely shifts itself from the very start after this kind of exposition. And we see how the enchanter sort of, warns Taran, like in the Disney version, that there's this horned king and that he's very bad and you should watch out. And that Henwin plays a very significant role in, and Henwin is, again, the oracle pig. And again, it's described in the original work as well as him being the oracle pig. But basically in the Disney version, we have sort of Dalbin telling Taran that he should take the pig. Hi.
Jag kan ju köpa vad they have for printers in Best Buy. If they tell you.
I think it's better to go in and look.
Go, but don't we have any idea?
Okay. Yeah, I can look.
Compatible for iPad.
Yeah, I can look them up tomorrow morning. Apologies. Mom wanting me to do research for buying a printer. So basically, we have Taran in the Disney work being told that he needs to go away because the Horned King is such a huge threat to sort of this civilization or this kind of a world. And again, this is, I think, a different world as far as fantasy goes. I think the author of the original work wanted it to be a different world, and I think Disney wanted it to be a fairly different world as well, because you'll see how there's like mystical stuff in there, and it doesn't really resemble our world, so it kind of makes sense in that sense. But basically, in the Disney work, Dalbin just tells Taran that he should go away with the pig to some location for safety. And you kind of will see how this kind of resembles the Lord of the Rings. I think a lot of people compare the Black Cauldron to sort of a Lord of the Rings take, except Disney style. And that's how the Disney version tries to start itself off. But in the original work, it's fairly different. Dalbin actually tells Taran that he should watch out for the pig and that they shouldn't leave the farm. That Taran should stay on the farm with Henwin the pig. And then he gets this kind of nickname that you'll hear kind of thrown around in the Disney version, where he's described as the assistant pig by Cole, who's again a character that's just in the original work. He's kind of mad, obviously, Taran, as well as in the Disney work, of taking care of the pig. And he kind of doesn't want to take on the responsibility, and it's been difficult for him because the pig is just so, I guess, fairly jumpy and runs around everywhere. Basically, one day in the original work, the Henwin gets very jumpy, and then she just takes off, and she goes into this forbidden forest, and basically Taran tries to chase after her, and he sort of ends up not exactly sure where he is. And then he comes across these warriors, and he doesn't know who they are, but I think he assumes that one of them is like the Horned King, so he runs away, sort of in fear. And basically, he escapes, but then he's just so tired from running and from spending all of this energy that he just passes out. And basically when he awakes, he finds that one of the wound that he got, actually I guess he got a wound from one of the soldiers as he was running away. He realizes this is healed, and we come across a character that is also not in the Disney work, but I'll kind of go back to the Disney plot as this goes on. But basically, this Gwydion character is a prince, and he rules sort of the House of Doli, and he wanted to actually meet Henwin, and wanted to sort of consult the pig himself, because he knows of sort of the powers that the pig has, and like being an oracle, sort of telling the future and such. And basically they both decide to find where Henwin is together, Taran and Gideon. And then this is when they encounter Gurgi, who is described fairly similarly like in the Disney version, a hairy humanoid living in the forest. Although the Disney version described, or as he's pictured a little bit shorter, and for some reason he sounds like Gollum, and he looks like a cross between Gollum and Geppetto for some reason. It's kind of hilarious. But in the Disney version, none of this stuff of going into the Forbidden Forest really technically happens, because they don't really describe a forbidden forest. Taran just goes on a path because, again, Dalbin tells him to leave, and then due to his own inability to take care of the pig and not think about himself for 1 minute, Taran basically loses the pig, and the pig is taken away, and the pig is actually taken away to the Horned King's castle directly, and I believe it's by I want to say it's a dragon-like thing, and basically when he's on the road, he ends up running into Gurgi, and then we kind of see a little bit of Gurgi sort of to start off with, and in the fact that he's a little bit more on the obnoxious side in the Disney version, but he seems to be portrayed, I think, in the original work as a little bit more useful and resourceful, whereas in Disney they kind of try to play around with him and try to make him more of, again, entertaining and not so not a character that really kind of moves the plot forward. And you'll kind of see how this kind of point of Taran encountering Gurgi ends up in the Disney version, if you choose to watch that version, and to what extent the relation and to how the relationship sort of plays out. But in the original work, Gurgi just comes out saying straight off the bat that he's seen Henwin, and he's seen him cross a river Avrin northward, who which is also able to lead them to the Horde King's camp, which is fairly useful information. But it seems like more in the Disney version they sort of stumble upon the Horned Kings, and they don't call it a camp. I mean, it's a castle in the Disney version. Just Gurgi and Tarn, because again we don't have this other character named Gideon. And basically, as the original work continues, there under the cover of darkness they observe a ceremonial sacrifice of captives by the local warlords who have joined with the Horned King. Gideon surmises that their target will be Ser Dathil, far to the north, the home castle of the House of Dawn. He determines to ride that way in warning rather than look for the pig. He explains much. He explains much Pideian geography to Turin, and I guess this world is sort of called Pideian, or the area that they're within and they're encompassed by. So I think it is more established in the original work that there is this kind of a world going on. Whereas as Disney, you do feel the sense that it is another world, but you don't really get a sense of where they are, or all you know is like that, yeah, there's this Horned King's castle place, but you don't really get a real deep sense of geography. It's not something like Lord of the Rings where it's fairly structured and you know where certain places kind of are because they show you through the maps. You don't see any map in the Disney version whatsoever, so you're given really no guidance as to how things are structured in this world for the most part. But basically, as the original work continues, Gurgi flees when 4 scouts discover the companions. Gideon, I really don't know how to pronounce his name, captures one by enchantment and slays another, so the horsemen fall back. But a pair of undead foot soldiers remorsefully approach the Cauldron born. Gideon orders Tarn to flee for his life on the horse Mehengor, and they end up being taken to the Queen Archean in Spiral Castle. The sorceress asks Gideon to join her in the overthrow of Arion. Once her consort, and to join her in ruling Prydian together. And again, Prydian is kind of sort of the Middle Earth here. And he and Tarn are separately taken below when he refuses. Okay, so in case you don't know what Arwan is, it's kind of like, I almost want to say that the Horned King as well as this Aron character are both kind of bad guys here. But there is no mention of this in the Disney version of another villain or another antagonist. But this antagonist is fairly present here. We'll kind of see, I think, more of in the second book how he plays more into this. But basically, what you have to understand is as Turin is going through, I think he and Gurgi get separated at some point. I can't remember exactly how that happens in the Disney work, but I know that Turin ends up getting into the castle in the Disney work, again, because the Horde King has a castle. And that's where he ends up being captured, and that's where he ends up being put into the dungeon for. But in the original work, he is put into the dungeon by this Spiral Castle, who was ruled by Queen Acheron. So again, it's kind of like all these different plot points that Disney kind of decided, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to even bother half her character there. So, and this is where we sort of get Princess Eilonwy introduced. But what basically happens is that in his dungeon cell in the original work, Taran is visited by Princess Eilonwy. I think that's how you pronounce it. She lives in Spiral Castle to learn enchantment from her self-proclaimed aunt, Archon. She knows all the castle secrets, including how to come and go anywhere. Taran suspiciously tells her little, but asks her to free his companion, then himself, and bring weapons. Eilonwy agrees, perhaps to spite Atrin. She returns without weapons and leads Taran out of his cell, through the labyrinth of tunnels. Suddenly Taran falls through a collapse to a lower level. She does not know, but she joins him nevertheless. They find the evident barrow of a lord with many guards. This is the death chamber of High King Rita, the last to wield the legendary sword Digiruin. Okay, and this is where sort of similarly we have this concept in the Disney version as well with this sword. Except it sort of plays into this differently. And also Eilonwy's motivations are completely different because she's also captured in the Disney work. It's not like here where she's free about to go wherever she wants, and she's happens to be connected to somebody within the castle who is the queen. And I guess this is what makes her a princess, because she's because Archon is her aunt. So that all makes sense in itself. And in the Disney version, we see how in the Horned King's castle they come across this one particular sword, and then Taran is able to use the sword in the Disney version on several occasions, and use its powers in order to be able to sort of fight against the enemy, being the Horned King and his minions, so to speak. But they do come up in a similar way where they're trying to both escape together in the Disney version, and then they come across the sword. But that's really all that's fairly similar to the works as far as anything is concerned. It's just how they set it up is a little bit differently. But basically, in the original work, they take the weapons after they find this chamber and the sword, and continue through the catacombs and breaches to an exit in the woods. As they emerge, Spiral Castle is sheathed in blue light, and they see it collapse. Nothing like this happens in the Disney work. And then we see in the original work that, perhaps owing to Taran's secrecy, the man who waits with Mehengar is not Geoden, but Flufidur Flam, a king by birth but a wandering storytelling bard by choice. Okay, this is a character that also is captured by the Horned King in the Disney work, and he is a bard. But I don't believe it's mentioned that he's a king, or that he was a king. And basically, Disney tries to use him in a similar way that they use Gurgi with like comic relief and such. I have to admit, he's probably a better comic relief than Gurgi, as far as I can tell from the Disney work. But continuing on with the original work, the three, meaning Flufidur, Eilonwy, Princess Eilonwy, and Taran, search the ruins, salvage some weapons and other equipment, and mourn Gideon's death. Okay, I think it is assumed by them because since Gideon did not somehow escape, and because the whole place kind of collapsed, that it's assumed that he's gone. And Eiddileg is now homeless and will travel with them naturally. She has taken the king's sword from the tomb, legendary Dradium, and its departure has destroyed the castle. Okay, this is where we get some kind of sense, and where the world kind of tries to establish how certain things work. Whereas in the Disney work, I really think that they don't try to make the sword so powerful in that sense that it can, if for some reason it's taken from someplace, it's something collapses, but they do make it powerful in the sense that it can be a good weapon, and it's something that more Taran uses and that Taran takes, as opposed to Eiddileg, which I find to be interesting. But we'll see in the original work how Gurgi rejoins Taran with news of the great army nearby. Taran chooses to take up Gaidudian's task to warn Dathel rather than to search for the pig. Fufador gives more geography lessons. Again, this is all kind of trying to, I think, establish to the audience a familiarity with the world. Unfortunately, they are spotted and pursued by Cauldron born, whom they flee day and night. Okay, and this kind of Cauldron born is explained more in sort of the second book, I believe. So once that comes, I'll be able to sort of explain a little bit what they are. They have no food and finally stop for Gurgi to scrouge. He falls from a tree and breaks his leg. Asks Taran to kill him rather than let him be a burden or leave him alive. Taran refuses and a long friendship begins. Okay, well, we kind of see in the Disney work how the relationship that's sort of established with Taran and Gurgi is a little bit different. In the Disney work, Taran clearly doesn't really particularly like Gurgi in the beginning, and for various reasons. And then you see how later on he becomes sympathetic towards him, and this kind of goes more into the climax of the Disney version. And you kind of see how Gurgi comes back into certain parts of the picture, and how that climax sort of plays out, and I'll try to explain that further as I continue on. But from what I can gather, it seems like Taran in the original works, for the most part, from what I have researched, seems to be more of the character that'd be willing to be that kind of noble person. Whereas the Taran in the Disney version kind of tries but yet fails every time because of his kind of ego that he has, and his inability to be smart and I guess maybe compassionate towards others at times. And then you sort of see how the whole point is that Taran changes at the end. But here it seems like they established Taran in the original work as someone who wouldn't take these kinds of forceful steps against someone. And it seems like Gurgi to me isn't really portrayed in the original work as to be fairly annoying. So it sort of would make sense that Taran would suddenly maybe develop more of a friendship with him, compared to the Disney work where it might have been more of a challenge for him because of Gurgi's kind of obnoxious nature. But basically that's kind of all you need to know sort of so far from what I'm explaining. But in the original work, Gurgi's leg becomes infected, and fatigue induces a fever in Eilonwy. They carry both on horse, but slowly. Barely they outlast or outdistance the deathless warriors, weaken with time and distance away from Nuvin, which I guess is it's like a place within this world again that we've established. They turn from pursuit, but they have driven the companions far east of their northward course. Okay, I think it's sort of established as well in the original work that they kind of are getting lost and confused. It seems like in the Disney work, although I think they may not be sure where they are at certain points, always something seems to kind of show up, and it doesn't seem like their conditions are so waning, and there's not really a lot of tension, I think, in the Disney work. But I think what the original work is trying to establish here is a little bit more tension of the circumstances and how difficult it is for the characters to get to where they need to go. So, as the original work continues, Gadudion's horse, Melangar, intervenes and leads them to a valley of Meduin, which is hidden from humankind. Meduin heals Gurgi, while Taran discovers the bees and chickens of Sir Dalibin, but not the pig. Nor does Meduin know of Henwig's flight. Meduin respects Taran's manner and welcomes the orphan to stay. Taran loves the valley and is tempted to leave worldly responsibilities, but still feels obligation to warn Sar Dathaniel. Meduin gives him provisions and directions. So it seems like that they do get some guidance and assistance from Meduin the horse. But basically, it kind of feels also, too, from what I'm explaining, too, that again, it seems like Taran has this kind of conflicting thing going on where he wants to be free from these kinds of responsibilities that he has to take, but he still has this kind of obligation. Whereas in the Disney work, I don't think that's really enforced so much. I don't think this kind of obligation is really forced onto Taran. I think for the most part he does things out of in order to sort of maybe prove himself, and you'll kind of see how he sort of changes into thinking more about himself. But I think in the original work it is established that he does care for others and that he feels like these obligations are important to not only him but to everybody else that surrounds him. So it's kind of like that, where I think for the most part Taran stays pretty much the same character throughout the book, whereas in the Disney version they try to establish this kind of change a bit. But that's basically the original work so far. But as it continues, it says that their way is mountainous. When they encounter a lake of black water, Taran tries to take an easier route by wading through shallows rather than clambering around. Instead, they find themselves drawn away from the shore and finally swept underwater to the realm of the fair folk. Something that's really not explored so much in the Disney work. Gurgi escapes, but guards take the others to the King Eiddileg, again, not in the Disney version either, King Eiddileg, who treats them gruffly, but softens when Eilonwy expresses rare gratitude for all the fair folk have done for humankind. Gurgi finds them with news that he has spotted Henwin. The dark folk rescued her, but Eiddileg grudgingly agrees to let Taran have her, to re-equip their party and to provide a guide. From what I could tell, I couldn't really figure out what the fair folk were, but basically, they do establish in the Disney work how there is these kinds of, I want to say they're like fairly like dwarf like fairies, and they do help Turin and everybody else sort of give them some assistance throughout the Disney work. But I don't think that they provide necessarily a guide. I just think that they provide them to get from one place sort of to the next. But in the original work, there is this guide named Doli, which is a red-haired dwarf. And yeah, again, you'll kind of see how I think Disney tried to do the same thing, except these dwarf-like creatures have like wings, so they're kind of like fairies in a way. It's rather odd. But basically, this dwarf leads them in the original work on a good pace to Skardathil until they encounter an injured fledgling Gwathite, one of the great birds of prey that Arwen has enslaved. Okay, Arwen is again a bad guy, but that's not really explored or focused on. We're more focusing on the Horned King in this particular book, but the Ghanaians are not in the Disney work either. So again, this world I think is again, I think this world is a little bit more established than the Disney work. But basically, Doli would kill the eye of Arwen, and Fudur agrees, but Taran determines to save it and deliver it alive to Sisardathil. He takes time to build a cage and tend its wounds. The Ganthiant recovers quickly and escapes overnight, much due to Doli's fury. Later the same day, Henwin also escapes and flees just before the scouts of the Horned King's army spot them all. The companions repel the scouts and continue to Sardathil, but can now hope to reach it only barely ahead of the army. In fact, before they see the castle, vanguard troops approach them. Fludur orders Taran and Eilonwy ahead on Mehingar, while he and Doli and Gurgi stand to fight. Again, none of this happened in the Disney version at all. Mehingar carries Taran and Eilonwy straight through a party of foot soldiers, but the Horned King sees them and gives chase himself. He catches them at the top of a hill and breaks the boy's sword on the first blow. Taran seizes Daunian, the sword, from Eilonwy, but lacks the noble birth needed to draw it, exposing only a part of the blade. White flame burns his arms, but throws him to the ground and momentary safety. Just before losing consciousness, he sees another man in the trees and hears an unintelligible word. The Horned King mask melts and he bursts into flame. Okay, this is, I think, sort of playing into the climax. But in the Disney work, we get a fairly different climax. The Horned King, and again, we see how the Black Cauldron concept comes into play. The Horned King wants to use this kind of this cauldron, this magical cauldron, to summon his to summon minions to sort of to take over this world. And in the climax, the Cauldron sort of turns on him, and you'll kind of see how the Cauldron sort of it sort of peels off his skin when Turin sort of pushes him to that course, and once the Cauldron starts acting up, for reasons they don't really explain in the Disney work for some reason. I just want to leave that open. But basically, that's really how the I think again it is explained when actually in the climax when we see Gurgi sort of return and sort of become part of the group. And once they're recaptured again by the Horned King in the Disney work, and are kind of used for the climax, it's established that Gurgi sort of sacrifices himself in order for everyone else to survive, and in doing so, this kind of acts up the Cauldron and causes the Horned King sort of to fall. And basically this is kind of where we get this this gruesome death, and it doesn't really involve the sword so much, unlike here where we see how the in the original work, how the blade of the sword sort of creates the Horned King to cause the Horned King to have his downfall, unlike in the Disney work where it's basically revolves all around the Cauldron. But basically, after all of this takes place in the original work with the Horned King's mask melting and him bursting into flames, Taran wakens in bed in a room with Henwin and Eiddileg. She tells him of the Horned King's death and his army's defeat. The man on foot was Gaidunian, who had been with Archon at another stronghold for his torture when Spiral Castle fell. Having survived the haunted Oethe and Theoth, he understands the hearts of all the creatures, which enabled him to communicate with the Giathiant, again, those birds that I mentioned. And Taran had saved, the fledgling led into the and basically from the Oracle Pig, he learned what could destroy the Horned King, his secret name, and was led to Taran by the fledgling again. Eiddileg has given Daeodrim the sword to him, recognizing his nobility. So again, we kind of see how Taran sort of saves the day with the sword, whereas in the Disney work, it's kind of displayed more that Gurgi is kind of the hero here, and Taran is the one who kind of learns sort of a lesson, whereas Taran is the one that's taking up nobility, but doing it in a way where it was really in his character to begin with to do so. And basically, the companions are given treasures from Ciar Nathaniel in recognition of service to the House of Dawn. Eiddileg gets a ring made by the fair folk. Gurgi, a wallet of food that cannot be depleted. Fluter, a golden harp string that can never break. Doli, the ability to turn invisible, which he usually lacks. And this is interesting, though, that they mention the golden harp, because Disney uses Fluter's harp as sort of a kind of a comic gag, and you'll kind of see how they use that in the Disney version. But And he has that like on like right away once his character's introduced, unlike in the original work here where he's being given this as kind of like a gift. So in the course of his adventures, Taran realizes more and more that Dalbin was right, and that the Cario Dalbin is where he most wants to be, living the quiet life of an assistant pig keeper. He asks only to return home, for he has learned its value, and Gudjon accompanies him personally, along with Elmi and Gurgi, who are now homeless. Okay, so this is sort of the end of the first book. And I want to first discuss the other book first before I discuss sort of the Disney kind of ending to all of this, after like the Horned King dies and such, and to sort of tell you certain things that happens within the Disney version that's sort of consistent to the second book. But as far as everything else goes, it seems like Taran sort of learned something more, I think, that was part of maybe the Disney version, but maybe not the central point. That being that the simple life is a lot more, I guess, welcoming once you go on these kinds of adventures and such, and how maybe having such a simple task as taking care of a pig is actually maybe more worthwhile than maybe all these kinds of adventures. Even though I think the Disney version maybe does try to address itself in that way, I don't think it's so forced upon. I think it's more of the idea of Taran maybe becoming more loving and caring for other people than just himself, and being sort of a selfish, egotistical boy. That's what I think the Disney version really focuses on. But here we can tell that Taran isn't really that egotistical, unlike how the Disney version seems to portray him. So the last part that basically I'm going to address is, again, the second book, which is actually called The Black Cauldron. And basically in the original work, the story opens at Sisar Dalbin, and I guess they call everything that is like a location, I guess that Sar is maybe like a county or a state or something, where Dalbin the enchanter has raised the orphan Taran from infancy. It is early autumn, more than a year after the defeat of Arwen's army and the death of his warlord, the Horned King. Okay, this is where we get sort of an explanation as to Arwen is someone who is actually higher than the Horned King, which is actually fairly interesting. Whereas the Disney work really displays the Horned King as this horrible, frightening, and power-hungry and scary being that is that can't be threatened, or someone who really shares any kind of power with anyone. So it's kind of interesting to see this other person that's just so much higher than him. And basically, in the original work, Prince Gudjon has called allies to a council hosted by Dalbin. Eventually, the Black Cauldron is active, generating more of the undead Cauldron-born army from the men who are disappearing. And again, this is where we get a similar idea as to how the Horned King gets his army in the Disney work, because these Cauldron-borns are technically the things that you'll see if you've seen the Disney version, where these skeletons come out and they kind of walk like zombies and such, and they're the undead. That's basically kind of the same thing here. And basically, in the original work, Gudjon proposes to capture it. King Morgaunt will lead an attack on Anuvil after Anuvin After a small party led by Gudrun has parted company to enter by a mountain pass known only to Cole, and again this is where we get this other character that's on the Disney work as well, Cole, that I mentioned. At that point, 3 will remain behind with the pack animals. Adion, the adult son of the chief bard Taliesin, Taran, and Eiddileg, prince of Pen Larkau, who is arrogant, weary, strong, and threadbare. Eiddileg disdains Taran for his place on the farm and his unknown patronage. Taran envies Eiddileg for his noble birth, despite Talbin's counsel that youngest son of a minor king has only his name and his sword. Both are dismayed to share a role with no chance for glory. This is kind of interesting because we don't really see any kind of competition between Taran and somebody else, really. In the Disney work, it seems like Taran doesn't really have someone really to compete with of title or maybe affection. It seems like that there's no big conflicts with him other than himself, and the fact that he does very stupid things several times within the Disney film. And it seems like here that they try to create this kind of jealousy between these two characters. And Eiddileg is non-existent in the Disney version, does not exist. And basically in the original work, as it continues, beside the feud between the young men, all goes smoothly until Gudrun's company finds that the cauldron has disappeared. No way. And this is where we get a fairly consistent, important detail different than in the Disney version, because in the Disney version it's emphasized that nobody had the cauldron to begin with. It was really all about sort of kind of finding the cauldron and using its powers, and in doing so, Taran wanting it destroyed, and the Horn King wanting to use it for power-hungry purposes. So again, there is no point where the cauldron is being held safe or concealed. It's just somewhere out there, and it's kind of a goal for Taran in the movie to sort of be the one to figure out where exactly it is, so they can sort of destroy it in a sense. So that's really kind of the point with the Disney version. So basically, in the original work, the company rejoins the regard in haste because the huntsman of Anuvin has been deployed. Meanwhile, the uninvited Princess Eiddileg and man/beast Gurgi have caught up with the quest from behind. So again, we see how in this tale as well, Gurgi and Eiddileg play a role. Gudrun and Cole are scattered, but thanks to Doli, the fair folk, all others find refuge underground in a fairfolk waypost maintained by Gwenstil, and again this character non-existent in the Disney version. From Gwenstil and his pet crow Ka, they learn that the cauldron has been stolen by the 3 witches, Ordu, Orwin, and Orgoch, who reside in the bleak marshes of Morva. Okay, this is where we sort of get a kind of difference, a similarity too. They do come across 3 witches in the Disney work, and they do sort of play a pivotal role with the cauldron and as to its location. But basically, when they depart the waypost, Eiddileg rides southward, determined to retrieve the cauldron heroically. in the original work. For his safety with the huntsmen abroad, Adian leads the others in pursuit. Taran, Alui, Gurgi, and Doli, and the wandering bard Flufedur Flam. When they are attacked and scattered, Alduin is mortally wounded, and Taran inherits his brooch, whose gift and burden is prophetic dreams and visions. With its guidance he gathers and leads all but Doli towards the marshes. From the fringe he both leads a pursuing band of huntsmen to their deaths. Ordu and her sisters explain that Aron once paid them a great price to borrow the cauldron. And then again, this is where we get the Arwen again is the antagonist that is actually above the Horned King. They retrieve it only when overdue. In their way, they welcome friends of little Dalbin, but they decline even to reveal it. Eventually and reluctantly, Taran barters the brooch of Adian. Now the companions try to destroy their cauldron, but learn from the witches that they can be achieved only by a living person who knowingly and willingly climbs in to die. Instead, they resolve to take it home to Dalbin. Okay, and this is sort of where we get sort of a similarity here within the Disney work, and how the witches basically explain the same thing, like, yeah, it can't be destroyed unless somebody is willing to die. And they also kind of bargain and trade too, except Turin gives like that sword up in exchange for the cauldron, basically. And that's how it really works in the Disney work. And again, the cauldron in itself is sort of destroyed by kind of Gurgi taking that sort of step. But here it's established that they don't want anyone to be sacrificed in any way. So they'll just take the cauldron home to Dalbin, so it'll be kept somewhere safe. So basically in the original work, they lose the heavy and cumbersome cauldron at the ford of the river Tevlin. Eldir discovers the impasse and offers to help if they will credit him for the whole enterprise. Tarn agrees, yet Eldir rides off with the cauldron alone when they have freed it. So you'll kind of see how the Eldir guy is kind of probably trying to get some power of his own. And soon the companions meet the army of Morgaunt, who welcomes them into his camp. Unfortunately, he's a traitor. He shows Eldrin beaten and bound, and the cauldron waiting to generate its own undead legion. He will spare them if Taran will enter personal service. Later, Doli arrives invisibly and cuts everyone's bonds. Eldir determines to rush to the cauldron and make the sacrifice himself. Although wounded, he is able to force himself into the opening, and it shatters. Okay, so instead of Gurgi going inside the cauldron, like in the Disney work, we see how Eldir is willing to sacrifice himself. Which is fairly interesting, and I think fairly sort of impacting in a way. And basically towards the end of the original work, Gudin, King Smoit, and his army defeat Morgaunt in battle. The story closes as Taran, Alui, and Gurgi take leave of Gudin at the verge of the Sayer Dalbin. Okay. Disney work plays out a little differently. Even though Gurgi sacrifices himself in the climax, he is resurrected, and everybody lives sort of the happily ever after Disney. Yay! We defeated the bad guy, Horned King. Woohoo! The end, and we kind of all go home, and you know everybody's all happy, and they kind of just drift off together. That's kind of how the Disney work ends itself. So there's a lot of things within this original work that are fairly different. It would have been fairly difficult for me to memorize, so again, I kind of had to pull all of this stuff together and just kind of read off and explain to you a little bit as to what everything means and what's going on. But basically, I think the original work has a lot to offer. I would definitely encourage anybody, if you're into fantasy, this would probably definitely appeal to you, these chronicles. And again, they are called the Chronicles of Birion, I believe. Birion. I am terrible at pronouncing these. Bryddain, Bryddain, by Lloyd Alexander. So, if you're interested in fantasy, definitely check those chronicles out. But I left out the other three because Disney, from the most part, these are probably, from the two that I've explained, those are like the closest. Those are like the closest to anything that's in the Disney work. Pretty much, for the most part, it seems like. I apologize if this might be a little confusing as to me going back and forth between Disney and original work. Sometimes these plot points are sometimes a little bit difficult to explain, and into the fact that there are a lot of names, and these names are fairly hard for me to pronounce. So if anybody was confused by some name that I brought up, or was confused in any way, shape, or form, I deeply apologize, but I'm kind of limited here as to how I can explain all of this to you. But for the most part, if anybody has any questions, comments, concerns about anything that I've explained, I'd be more than happy to answer them and be more than happy to help you. But I think that's really all I can explain from it. I apologize if this video runs a little bit long, but I feel like I should explain myself. But I think that's really all I can say. They're both, I think, interesting. Even though it's probably declared probably one of Disney's more weaker works, it still has an interesting source material behind it. So I think that's definitely worth noting and taking into consideration, as well as the Disney film, if you find anything in the Disney film to be appealing to you. But I think that's really all I can say. Any questions, comments, concerns? More than happy to answer them, and until next time. Bye-bye, everybody. And as far as all the other characters are concerned, fairly the same. Except maybe Gurgi and Taran from what I've mentioned. But, yes, I think that's really everything that I can hash out. But, until next time, everybody.